Everybody, welcome back to the channel. HTM here, and the solo build rankings I'm about to go over with you in this video might actually shock you. That's because almost every other solo tier list I've seen for ESO tends to use only the best gear sets possible. Mythic items like the Ring of the Pale Order or the Oaken Soul Ring that amp up your healing and your damage, or Trials gear sets which make running out of resources on your build basically impossible. Now, the problem is that obviously with running nothing but the best gear, you don't get the best comparison between classes. In fact, min-maxing gear kind of makes all the classes perform the same without much differences between them. And that's why for this solo tier list, I wanted to do something completely different. I didn't want to use Trials gear or Mythics, so instead I decided to use the same armor set for all classes. I ended up using the 12-piece crafted set from the Necrom chapter called Shattered Fate. All this set does is it gives you basic stats, things like weapon and spell damage, critical chance, and offensive penetration. I streamlined the gear using light armor for Magicka builds, medium armor for stamina builds. Magicka builds used Destruction Staff, stamina builds used Two-Hander and Bow. Magicka builds used Witchmother's Potent Brew, while stamina builds used Dubious Cameron Throne, and all builds use the Thief Mundus Stone in terms of baseline for testing. Also, no skills outside of class skills were allowed on any of the builds that I tested here, with a couple of exceptions, only to fill in necessary gaps for some generic buffs and debuffs. That included only Inner Light or Camouflage Hunter for Major Prophecy and Savagery, Barb Trap for Minor Force, Endless Hail or Wall of Elements to proc a backbar glyph, and then either Caltrops or Elemental Drain to get Major Breach if needed. But other than those basic buffs, classes had to use nothing but their own skills and passives to survive. Now, in terms of content for testing, I used a mixture of DLC dungeons and world bosses to compare classes against each other, including the first boss of Coral Airy, the entire dungeon of Falkreath Hold, and the very hard-hitting world boss Maynir Stoneskin that's in the zone of Rivenspire. And most classes did survive all three challenges, though a few did not, and obviously those classes placed lower on this list. Finally, I did not use any heavy attack builds in my comparisons here because, again, like using mythic items or trial sets, I think that heavy attack builds make the classes too similar and therefore more difficult to create a real comparison. Plus, in many cases, a heavy attack build using a lightning staff, especially one that uses a mythic on top of that, is going to outperform both a stamina and a Magicka-focused build on the same class for solo content, because heavy attack builds don't have any sustain issues and they also have a ton of easy AoE damage, which some classes do not have access to. If you'd like to see a heavy attack build tier list though, that's definitely something I can work on, so let me know down in the comments section. First up in the C tier, we have the Magicka Arcanist, which seems impressive on paper with lots of buffs, heals, and damage shields. Many skills in their kit even serve multiple purposes, like Recuperative Treaties, which deals damage, restores stamina and Magicka, and also provides major brutality and sorcery, which is awesome. Now, the Arcanist class is also known for their amazing Fate Carver Beam skill, which is very easy to use. It's great for soloing content as well as it deals AoE damage while also providing a damage shield at the same time. Also, the Arcanist class passives are some of the best in the game, like Splintered Secrets, which gives you almost 1,000 penetration per ability slotted, so you'll have at least 3 to 4k more penetration than most classes, plus the Erudition passive for a whopping 18% bonus Magicka and stamina recovery, which is pretty insane as far as passives go, but for many reasons the Magicka Arcanist still falls short for soloing content, at least with this most basic build. Don't get me wrong, Magicka Arcanist is still a blast to play, but it can be challenging, especially without mythics. For one thing, the class feels extremely fragile when using light armor. Using medium armor on a stamina Arcanist does feel a lot better and you take less damage overall, but you also have less access to good passive healing skills on the Arcanist class compared to other classes like the Nightblade, the Templar, or the Dragonknight. Now, our best and pretty much only option in regard to passive healing is a skill called Reconstructive Domain. This is really only a support heal though, not a main heal, as it ticks very slowly every 2 seconds, and the healing is not that powerful either. Though the buffs like Minor Courage and all the recovery bonuses are nice for sure, but trying to play Magicka Arcanist without mythics, as I said, like the Ring of the Pale Order, feels a lot harder than it really should due to that lack of healing, so word to the wise there. Now, there is the Cephaliarch's Flail skill on the other hand, which is a very nice semi-spammable skill that deals AoE damage, debuffs enemies, and also heals you back, but only the Stamina Morph does the healing, and it's going to be hard to run this skill on the true Magicka Arcanist build even though you need that extra healing no matter what. So that's the main reason why Magicka Arcanist is so low for me on this list. As we'll see, Stamina Arcanist is better because it can spam Flail all day and reap the benefit of that constant healing while also stacking Crux, while the Magicka Arcanist can really only use this skill 2 to 3 times in a row, and then you run into lots of healing and sustain issues. Next up for us is the Magicka Warden, which I put at C+. Now, again, this is just the basic solo build without Trials gear, without Mythics, and I'd say it's basically average. Now, on the positive side, you do have solid self-healing and survivability on the Magicka Warden. Most of your passive healing on this build comes from doing damage with your Animal Companion skill due to the passive called Bond with Nature, which heals you back when you're using those skills. So this means your Spammable gives you some healing, as does Deep Fissure, and even rebuffing with your damage and sustain skill, Betty Netch, that's going to heal you as well. More healing can be obtained by running Lotus Blossom, which heals you on light and heavy attacks while also providing Major Prophecy. So as long as we're doing damage, you're basically also healing, which works pretty well. Now, the only problem there is if you get knocked down or stunned, obviously you won't be dealing damage, so no healing for you, though there are many options on the Warden class for a burst heal skill. My favorite right now is called Living Trellis. This passively heals you when you take damage, but you can also spam it in emergencies for big heals, especially if it crits, usually over 10k health or so. Defensively, as I said, the Magicka Warden also feels really solid. Wardens get a unique defensive armor skill called Ice Fortress, which supplies you with minor protection, plus the Warden ultimate, Northern Storm, gives major protection, which I recommend you cast at crucial times in combat for a nice offensive and defensive combo. If you don't have enough ultimate for that, the Healing Thicket ultimate can give you a nice healing area to stand in, helping you to survive for longer when you really need it. This combined with the Warden passive called Maturation, which buffs your health by an extra 10% after healing, makes your defensive kit really solid on this class overall. And I definitely survived some heavier hits on this class compared to others. But where the Magicka Warden falters is really in 2 areas, that is damage and sustain. For the Magicka Warden, the damage just really isn't there without Mythics and Trials gear. Your rotation does feel clunky, and your main spammable in Screaming Cliff Racer only does single target damage. You can use other DPS skills like Force Pulse, for example, to get a bit more splash damage in your kit, but remember, we're focused on comparing class skills for this video. You can also increase your damage slightly by running more dots like Swarm or Winter's Revenge, but as a solo build, I found that I needed more space for buffs and for healing, and there just wasn't enough bar space to run those extra damaging skills. Something to keep in mind, because unlike the Arcanist, Warden skills tend to do less or have less effects combined into them, so bar space is always kind of an issue with this class. And yeah, sustain is just pretty brutal. I think it's the fact that you really only get one sustain skill on the Warden class, which is the Netch, and also the class sustain passives aren't as strong as other classes like the Arcanist or the Necromancer, for example. So on this build, I had to heavy attack a lot in between skills just to keep my Magicka bar full. So yes, Magicka Warden is a tough class in solo content at a base level until you hit those mythic items, which can improve things. Moving on up, we have the Stamina Warden, just slightly better than the Magicka Warden. Why is this? Well, we already covered the defensive kit when talking about Magicka Warden, which is probably its strongest attribute for the Stam Warden as well. But with Stamina, you get to use medium armor, so you'll take a bit less damage, and more importantly, you can also use skills like Brawler or Carve to add in some extra AoE, and the damage shield you have there is much better than what you can get using light armor, which is just dampened magic. So defenses on the Stamina Warden are improved. Sustain is also improved, though not by much. With the Stamina Warden, you have a better spread of skills, roughly half Stamina skills and half Magicka skills, so the resource drain is less intense during combat. Things are just more spread out. Though I did need to heavy attack a few times during my test to get stamina back, it was much less than compared to the Magicka Warden, again, because we are spreading those costs out between both our stamina and Magicka pool instead of having, mostly everything cost Magicka. The rotation on the Stamina Warden feels a bit better too, or it's at least more forgiving. I used Subterranean Assault here, which automatically recasts itself after 6 seconds, whereas for the Magicka Warden, Deep Fissure does damage at 3 seconds and then 6 seconds, which is odd and it's a bit difficult to get used to in a rotation. But generally speaking, the Stamina Warden has the same kind of low damage output and awkward rotation that the Magicka Warden has, as well as the limited bar space and lack of a really good DPS spammable that's going to keep it out of the higher tiers for this list. Next up in the B tier for solo builds is the Magicka Necromancer. Now, speaking generally first, the Necromancer class is one of the most flexible and powerful options in ESO, whether you focus on Magicka or Stamina. You'll notice right away that it's also probably one of the tankiest classes out there, even at this most basic build type. One of the reasons for this is the Last Gasp passive, which gives you more health than most classes as a baseline. Sustain is also handled pretty well on the Necromancer class with passives like Death Gleaning and Undead Confederate, so the basics of a very strong build are already here. Damage can also be good on the Necromancer due to the Death Knell passive, which gives you a big boost to critical chance against low health targets. However, for a pure solo build, and especially without mythics like the Ring of the Pale Order, you're going to need to run a particular skill for some passive healing, and that is the Death Scythe skill. This is kind of like Brawler, but for healing, so the more enemies you hit, the bigger the heal you get, and there are both a Magicka and a Stamina morph for this skill. So it is great, but the only problem is that it is technically a tank skill, so the DPS is a bit lower if you're going to use this as your main spammable ability, which I did. But that's the trade-off here. You get much higher survivability, but lower DPS. Now, I did try using Ricochet Skull instead as my main DPS here, and I could not survive in harder content. So again, this depends on your gear loadout, access to mythics, and difficulty of content. But survival on the Necro is even higher when you consider their ultimate Ravenous Goliath, which basically makes you unkillable for 20 seconds, increasing your max health by a huge amount. Now, your survival on the Magicka Necro will be slightly lower than Stamina Necro, I feel like, because you don't have a class shield. Dampen Magic for light armor builds just isn't as strong as Brawler would be on a Stamina build, so you also have lower physical resistance due to using light armor too, so yeah, survival is going to be lower compared to Stamina Arcanist, and Sustain is also slightly worse than Stamina Arcanist because you have so many Magicka abilities on this setup with higher costs and also short duration, meaning you need to cast those Magicka buffs especially more often. For harder dungeons and bosses, you might need to spam Dampen Magic quite a bit, which costs a lot, and also heavy attack more frequently using the Lightning Staff to get some Magicka back. And yeah, you can use Blighted Blast Bones, which costs stamina to kind of spread resources out, but it's not a huge difference either way. That said, Magicka Necro is fun. It's very thematic if you like that summoner play style, and you're okay with something a bit slower, a bit more methodical approach to combat. So let's talk about Stamina Necromancer then, which comes in slightly higher at B+ tier for solo content. Now, as we've seen, the Necromancer class is already a great solo option due to their strong passives, their defensive potential, and self-healing. Now, the skills on the Stam Necro are basically the same as Magicka Necro, just choosing Stamina morphs where possible, and also running Brawler instead of Dampen Magic. Speaking of which, defensively, the Stamina Necro is better with more armor and more damage shield potential due to the Brawler skill. Stamina Necro is better in terms of sustain too, because you run about half Stamina abilities and half Magicka abilities similar to the Stamina Warden, so your resource drain from those skills is more evenly spread out, and this lets your Necro sustain passives work better because those restore both Stamina and Magicka at the same time. I even run Mystic Siphon here on the Stamina Necromancer for even more sustain, though you could probably swap that out for the Stamina version for more damage if you wanted to. Now, this is true of both classes, but why the Necro doesn't really rank higher is because their rotation is one of the most complex in the game, so they aren't really great for beginners. As I mentioned with the Mag Necro, your main buffs, like the Archer, which buffs your damage, your armor buff, and especially Spirit Guardian, all last 20 seconds or less. Spirit Guardian only lasts 16 seconds. That means you'll be bar swapping quite a bit more than any other class in the game. It's a very short timer, and I'm not sure why. You also have to get into the rhythm of using Blast Bones, which has a 3-second fuse, alternating 2 skills, then going back to Blast Bones, doing 2 more skills, Blast Bones, bar swapping to rebuff, etc. It can be a little bit intense to maintain all of that, especially if you're trying to solo a difficult boss and avoid all those boss mechanics. So while it can be strong for more experienced players, it's definitely not my favorite option to play because of those issues with the rotation. Moving on, we have the Stamina Arcanist, which I've ranked at an A- tier for this solo build. Now, it is the preferred version of the Arcanist for soloing in my opinion. It has superior damage, better sustain while also taking less damage due to running medium armor, and still benefiting from all the core skills and passives that the Arcanist class has to offer. It's really almost the same skills. In terms of damage, you're going to be running Fate Carver, obviously, as your main DPS. Awesome for AoE damage, plus the damage shield that you get. Keep in mind the scales with your highest resource, whether it's Magicka or Stamina. So that is one of the coolest parts of the Arcanist class, how those abilities scale with your highest resource. Speaking of which, you can, stack Crux easier with Cephaliarch's Flail being a stamina ability, so you'll have plenty of cost reduction and stamina recovery due to your medium armor passives, meaning that you can cast Cephaliarch's Flail basically infinitely and then drop your beam once you've stacked it up to 3 Crux. But like I've said, nearly everything else remains the same as the Magicka version here in terms of skills, except for Endless Hail and Caltrops being used on the back bar, Brawler, as we said, on the front bar. Now, while your class skill Impervious Rune Ward does look impressive on the tooltip, I've found that running Brawler on a stamina build is pretty much better, as this can scale higher against multiple targets, and it has a full 6-second duration, meaning it's a lot more reliable in terms of damage shields. Of course, the Arcanist ultimates are amazing. You have Languid Eye to burn through boss health bars very quickly, or Sanctum of the Abyssal Sea, which gives you a huge damage shield, great for those boss phases with lots of damage incoming. But really, the only thing that keeps the Stam Arcanist out of the S tier, in my opinion, is their lack of passive healing. And this is a big factor to consider. Remember, we're comparing classes without mythics here, and if you don't have access to something like the Ring of the Pale Order, which passively heals you, the Stam Arcanist is actually kind of difficult to play. We only really have Reconstructive Domain to put that AoE heal on the ground that only heals you every 2 seconds for a small amount. And yeah, you can spam Flail, but that also has a pretty small heal. So while this class does feel really good with the right mythics, without one, you might struggle a bit more than you expected. The Stamina Dragonknight class is a powerhouse in ESO for a few big reasons. Number one is they have one of my favorite passives in the entire game called Battle Roar. This gives you a burst of health, stamina, and magicka back whenever you cast an ultimate. And the amount that you get back depends on the ultimate's cost. So the higher the ultimate's cost, the more resources you get back. You can think of this as basically a free tri-stat potion whenever you need it. So it's amazingly useful, particularly when you're playing solo through difficult content. In fact, what I do is you can rotate a tri-stat potion with your ultimate, so you have that full restore effect every 20 to 25 seconds or so. It's very good for soloing, and it makes the class a lot of fun to play. And now the other benefit to the Dragonknight class and why I rank it so highly is its defenses. Much like the Warden and the Necromancer classes, DKs just feel very tanky. You have passives like Scaled Armor, which increase your armor value, Iron Skin, which increases your block mitigation, and Burning Heart, which increases your healing received. Then you also have many skills which have damage shields built into them, like your armor skill, Hardened Armor, as well as the amazing Ferocious Sleep ultimate. This one has a huge shield, and it's a very low ultimate cost to cast it. You also have lots of passive healing with skills like Burning Embers, Ash Cloud, and Cauterize, which cost magic, but you're not really doing anything else with your magic, so you might as well run them. And when you stack all of those, it gives you a very nice layer of passive healing, which is so important when soloing hard content in ESO, and it's just amazing for this class. DK also ranks higher than many other classes we've seen so far due to their AoE and dot damage potential. Skills like Noxious Breath do AoE damage and have Major Breach, reducing enemy armor. You can also use Eruption for more AoE damage and Snare. And even your Stamina DPS skill, Stone Giant, has a small AoE component. Plus, all of your ultimates do AoE damage as well. And many of these effects that I mentioned are also dots, so that's a big benefit too, because you just have to apply them once, either to the enemy or to the ground nearby, and then it's dealing damage all the time, and you can focus on avoiding boss mechanics, keeping up your shields, or healing yourself if needed. So SamDK is an easy playstyle, and it's very strong for solo content. Next up, we have the Stamina Templar, which looks pretty similar to Magicka Templar in most cases, though it does play quite a bit differently and has some additional options, especially when it comes to sustain. One thing you'll notice right away is that their main spammable Biting Jabs is very powerful. It does AoE damage and also gives us the major Sorcery and Prophecy buff, increasing our damage dealt by 20%, so that's very nice. This does free up the build a bit in terms of which potions you can use, and as you can also get Major Savagery and Prophecy for extra critical chance through using another class skill called Vampire's Bane. What this does is it makes our bar spaces a lot more open to running extra skills. Now, most of our dots and heals on the Stamina Templar cost Magicka to cast, so that is something to keep in mind, and you want to try to balance your skills on this class so you don't drain too much Magicka or too much stamina at any one time. But those passive heals you have on the Stamina Templar are very powerful, including Restoring Focus and Extended Ritual, which are ground-based, so you need to stay inside those ground effects to get the most benefit, which can be difficult in some content where you need to move around a lot. Thankfully, you will get Sustain and Healing from Restoring Focus just by casting it, though it is much better to stay in it if you can. But the best thing by far about the Stamina Templar, and why I really enjoy this class for soloing, is the bonus sustain and healing that you get from their class skill called Repentance. This is extremely unique and fun to use. It gives you and your allies 3,000 health and stamina back per corpse on the ground when you cast it, so it can easily take you from low on resources to maxed out in just a second if you have enough enemies dying around you to maintain the effect. This is a bit situational, as bosses who are completely solo are going to give you less sustain, though you also get the passive minor recovery buffs just for slotting it, so that's pretty good. But it's great, as I said, for running through mobs quickly and for bosses that have lots of adds, because that extra sustain and healing can come in really clutch, and it adds an element of strategy to combat as well, where you can save corpses on the ground for that big burst of stamina and health back only when you need it. Next up, we have the Stamina Nightblade class, which is great if you like a lot of single target burst damage and that feeling of an assassin class. It does definitely feel very powerful, even with just a basic solo build. So the strengths of the Nightblade class, obviously, it's that single target damage. For example, you have the ultimate incapacitating strike, which boosts your damage against a single target by 20%, which is a huge bonus. Along with that, you also have surprise attack for single target DPS, and your Spectral Bow for burst damage, plus Killer's Blade for an execute skill. So the Nightblade class can very quickly take down targets, which is great for boss fights, or bosses with dangerous adds, such as casters or healers that need to be eliminated quickly. On the defensive front, Nightblades and ESO are also well known for their healing potential with skills like Swallow Soul, which I do recommend you run, even on the Stamina Nightblade as a kind of heal over time skill, especially when playing without mythics like the Pale Order Ring. The extra healing that you can get from this skill is just too good to miss out on. Sustain is also very nice on this class, particularly when running Siphoning Attacks, which heals you and restores resources every second as long as you're dealing damage, plus you can cast it in emergencies to drain a bit of health and get even more resources back. This is one of, if not the best, sustain skills in the game right now, so make sure to put it somewhere on your skill bar. But if there's any downsides to the Nightblade class, it would be that single target focus, which can make it difficult, especially to deal with packs of enemies. It is easy to get overwhelmed on the Nightblade class. You're also somewhat dependent on weaving in light attacks to get the most out of your Spectral Bow bonus attack as well, so the rotation can be a bit more complicated when compared to other classes, which keeps this one just shy out of an S tier ranking for this video. Next, we have the A+ tier and the Stamina Sorcerer. This class is honestly amazing for solo content, and it always has been. Stamsorc is one of the simplest and easiest classes to play in ESO by far, where your survival is mostly built into the kit already with passive healing. Speaking of which, that passive heal is what the class is known for, and it's definitely their greatest strength with the skill called Critical Surge, which heals you once per second as long as you're dealing critical damage to a target, which shouldn't be hard for most builds. You can think of this as a mini Ring of the Pale Order, so as long as you have this buff on and you don't forget to rebuff yourself, you're pretty good to go in solo content, which is great. Again, for simplicity, you also have Dark Deal here. This is an amazing skill. It gives 2 heals in one thanks to the Blood Magic passive. So yeah, you can heal like 15k total health with this, plus get almost 4,000 stamina back and more stamina over time. That's crazy good sustain and healing, so make sure to use this skill as well. But the Stamina Sorcerer also has a surprising amount of damage, even with this most basic of builds, and especially AoE damage. This comes primarily from skills like Hurricane, which is a unique armor buff that also does increasing amounts of damage in an area while also granting you speed. Definitely one of the best defensive buffs in the game. Sorcerers also have very strong passives, which are great for soloing, like Unholy Knowledge to reduce the cost of all your skills by 6%, Power Stone to reduce the cost of your ultimates by 15%, Expert Summoner, which increases your resources, Blood Magic, which we mentioned, heals you when casting a dark magic skill, and there are actually many more. So the passives for this class are just great all around for solo content. Now, there is one class ultimate you'll probably be using like 95% of the time, which is the Storm Atronach. At only 170 ultimate, this is a pretty good option for damage and for a stun when it lands as well. But if there's anything that's keeping the Stamsorc out of the S tier, in my opinion, it's their main spammable DPS skill, Crystal Weapon. I don't know if it's just me, but I do not really like this skill. It doesn't weave very well with your basic attacks. It doesn't really feel like a skill, actually, more like a buff, plus it is single target. Now, I know it's cheating for the purposes of this build, but if you swap in silver shards from the Fighters Guild skill line, you will clear content so much faster, and it's way more fun to use. So just a quick tip there on the Stamina Sorcerer. Onto the Magicka Dragonknight next, and this is a really interesting class due to a very powerful main spammable ability, the Flame Whip, specifically the Flame Lash morph is what I want to talk about here. Now this skill alone, I think, puts it ahead of the Stamina Dragonknight for solo content due to its insane healing potential. We're talking 10k health back per hit for just our basic solo build, that's without trials gear or mythics again. Now, there are some hoops that you need to jump through to get the healing here and the reduced cost on the skill. Specifically, the target needs to be off balance. But if you immobilize or stun an enemy, Flame Lash can also proc in that case. And you can also get off balance pretty easily on bosses by using a Lightning Staff back bar with a shot glyph on your front bar weapon, which is what I ended up doing here. So when enemies are off balance, that's when your Flame Lash does bonus damage and a huge chunk of healing. And the Magicka DK at that point has the most healing potential in the game as a solo build, even surpassing classes which are known for healing like the Templar. That combined with a very good Burning Embers skill, which has an upfront heal and a heal over time component, means you're basically unkillable for most content once you figure out how everything works together. And by the way, Burning Embers can be recast immediately for a quick burst heal if your target has off-balance cooldown, for example. But yeah, if you put in a bit extra into your max health on the Magicka Dragonknight, you almost even don't need a damage shield because the heals on this are so strong. I rarely ended up using my shield at all on this setup. It was pretty crazy, but again, that's only versus off-balance targets. So yeah, the Mag DK has all the great benefits of the Stamina Dragonknight, including great ultimates, strong spammable skill, great sustain through the Battle Roar passive, and a very tanky playstyle, but with that massive healing potential as well, pushing them a bit higher on our tier list. And yeah, you can't really go wrong with this class once you master how it works, so have fun. But the Magicka Nightblade is another A+ tier solo build in my opinion, with some of the best passive healing in the game, plus the ability to play fully from maximum range rather than exclusively from melee range like the Stamina Nightblade and many other classes, making it just a bit stronger for most solo content. Now, in terms of healing, we already talked about Swallow Soul from the Stamina Nightblade, but you can use this as your ranged DPS skill on the Magblade, meaning you always have constant powerful self-healing as long as you're dealing damage with this skill. Combine this with Sap Essence for short-ranged AoE damage with another healing component thrown in, and now you have that important layered healing effect while also doing more AoE damage as well. Of course, you can get even more healing from siphoning attacks. We already talked about that skill. Make sure you slot that one as well. Merciless Resolve, once you stack up those light or heavy attacks, that's going to give you a burst heal plus more burst damage. And you even have the very powerful ultimate called Soul Tether. This is an AoE damage effect. It stuns targets, heals you back based on the amount of targets that you hit. So yeah, the Magicka Nightblade is really great in terms of its overall healing capabilities, letting you survive a lot more difficult content. Other than the healing though, you do need to keep a bit of an eye on your defense. One thing, for example, with the Nightblade class in general is they do not have a specific armor buff skill. Instead, you'll need to cast an ability from the Shadow skill line to proc your armor buff from your passives, which can be a little bit awkward. Typically what I do on both the Stamina Nightblade and the Magicka Nightblade is I'll use the Twisting Path skill here. This has about a 12-second cooldown, which lines up pretty well with the passive. So as long as you're keeping up Twisting Path, you're also keeping up your armor buff. That's kind of how that works. But other than that, your main forms of defense on the Magicka Nightblade is keeping your range and your mobility, kiting enemies out while you let your healing and your damage do its work to take down larger packs. It's definitely a different feel compared to classes like the Magicka Dragonknight or the Mag Templar, for example, which are more suited to standing their ground. The Magicka Nightblade is all about mobility. But that can be an advantage, especially against certain bosses who might have ground mechanics that force you out of that melee range. Now, the Magicka Nightblade rotation can also be a bit challenging to get used to at first, and it can take time to master, particularly stacking those light attacks to proc your Spectral Bow for the bonus damage and healing. But for those of you that are patient enough to perfect the class, it can be insanely powerful. But that brings us to our first S-tier solo build, which is of course the Magicka Templar, due to your ability to run Puncturing Sweeps as your main spammable DPS skill. This skill heals you back for a percentage of the damage you do, so the more damage you deal, the more healing that you're going to get back. And this is simply one of the best DPS skills in the game, if not the best for solo builds, due to its passive healing and its AoE cleave damage, and it makes the Magicka-focused Templar incredibly powerful just by default. But not only that, we also have Radiant Glory, the amazing Execute skill, which also, you guessed it, heals us back as we deal damage. So again, as long as you're doing damage on this class, you're getting some powerful passive heals, which is exactly what you need for soloing content in ESO. In terms of defensive skills, you'll have access to the very good damage shield skill called Sun Shield, which scales up that damage shield based on the amount of enemies that you hit with its initial damage, so it's kind of like a magic version of Brawler. And you want to run the same area heals that we ran on the Stamplar, like Extended Ritual, to help with healing in case you get stunned or you bar swap and you're no longer using Puncturing Sweep. Of course, no build is perfect, and keep in mind that even as of 2025, the Magicka Templar is still the only class in ESO without easy access to Major Brutality and Sorcery. That's only given to the Stamina Templar Biting Jab skill. So you're going to need to get that important buff somewhere else, usually either by using a Spell Power Potion or by running a skill that gives you the same buff, such as Degeneration from the Mages Guild. I didn't want to use any outside skills here, so I did run a Spell Power Potion for this particular class. But other than that, Channeled Focus is going to be very helpful, as this gives you 242 Magicka back every 1 second, whether you're standing in the rune or not. And you should combine this with Elemental Drain to debuff enemy armor and also give you Minor Magicka Steal for even more Magicka back when dealing damage. Also, don't forget to throw in a heavy attack now and then if you really are struggling or you need a little bit of extra Magicka. But due to the overwhelming healing potential of a Magicka Templar running Puncturing Sweeps, as well as its many other healing skills, powerful AoE damage, and its Execute finisher, this build is pretty insane. It's definitely recommended for beginners or even experienced players looking to do any type of solo content in ESO. But that brings us to our final S-tier build for this list, and that is the Magicka Sorcerer class. Magsorc is just a beast all of its own, and it brings many more useful skills to the table beyond what the Stamina Sorcerer did, which we already saw. Most important of these is definitely its unique magic damage shield skill, Hardened Ward, which is not only one of the strongest damage shields in the game, but it can also provide a mini burst heal at the same time. So it's basically a defensive must-have. Combine this with the passive healing we already talked about, using the Sorcerer's skill Critical Surge, and you're basically unkillable on this class. Now, in terms of damage, you can decide to go with pets for an easier, more passive approach, which is going to be great for beginners, or you can use more powerful offensive spells like Crystal Fragments, for example, to unleash some big burst damage, or you could even combine both approaches. Sorcerers also have one of the best finishers in the game, probably the best, in fact, in terms of AoE raw damage when you're using Mage's Wrath, as this does bonus damage to enemies below 20% health, but also spreads 100% of that damage out to nearby targets. So yeah, stuff just explodes when you're playing the Magicka Sorcerer. Of course, we have also extra mobility, we have armor and AoE damage from skills like Boundless Storm, and then a similar Sustain skill, which can also give you a quick burst of healing if needed in Dark Conversion. But all of this combined with all of the great Sorcerer passes, which we already looked at on the Stamsorc class, and you can see that the Magsorc is just one of the best all-around solo classes in the game, and that's just at the most basic level. When you include better gear, mythic items, or consider using a heavy attack build, then of course that's going to take things to a whole nother level. But hopefully you found this video helpful, and if you did, do me a huge favor and crush that like button to let YouTube know to share this video with others. There will be a written guide linked down below. Make sure to check that out for even more information on this solo tier list, as well as links to solo builds for all the classes that we discussed. solo guides, gear guides, and much more content for the Elder Scrolls Online. And as always, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you around in the next video. Everybody, one of the best features of HTM is our YouTube membership community, where you can unlock some really amazing perks for supporting the channel. Our level 2 membership, called the Elite Squad, is where I recommend you start because this unlocks tons of members-only builds and guides that you won't see anywhere else on YouTube. That's because each of our members-only builds are handcrafted to be completely unique, off-meta, and give you access to something really fun, powerful, and easy to play. For example, the solo Death Knight build focuses on insane self-healing and resource regeneration available to the Necro class in ESO, while the Unkillable Arcanist build focuses on channeled effects that buff your damage mitigation and shields for easy survival. We have the Unkillable Werewolf build focused on pure heavy attack carnage, and one of my favorites, a no-class skills Barbarian build, which focuses completely on two-handed abilities and is now supplemented with scribing skills, so it feels like a completely new class of its own. And these are just some examples of all the unique content on offer, and we're always updating and adding to this list every month. Plus, each members-only build also comes with an exclusive written guide only for channel members to make these even easier for you to build yourself. But of course, that's not all you get. We also have loyalty badges, which will appear next to your name in YouTube, plus early access to videos and access to our members-only Discord so you can ask questions and chat with myself and other players in our community. So if that sounds good to you, just click on that join button right beneath my video in YouTube to get started, and make sure to select the Elite Squad option to unlock those exclusive videos. Or go to hacktheminotaur.com/members for more information and to see the full list of absolutely everything you can unlock. We've even added some members-only guides recently, like my favorite hidden grind spots for ESO, so there is a truckload of content for you to explore once you sign up. Finally, I just want to say a quick thank you for supporting me and the HTM community. YouTube pays gaming creators only pennies when it comes to running ads on our videos, so it's channel members like you that actually keep this channel going now and into the future. Believe me, your support is greatly appreciated. So welcome to the squad, and I will see you around in the next video.